I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're going to cover on this episode the trans visibility Easter as it was declared by the Biden White House. I'll cover that topic. Will's going to talk about the rights that have been conferred to squatters of all people across the country. Ben will cover the Democrats' electioneering-industrial complex, and Inez will close us out on how euthanasia became the default option as opposed to the last resort. So I will go ahead and kick us off with the trans visibility Easter. And this was probably a much bigger story than the Biden White House anticipated. But essentially what happened is the Friday before Easter Sunday and on Good Friday, the Biden administration sent out a press release indicating that they were going to be proclaiming Easter Sunday, March 31st, as Trans Visibility Day. And this was not the first time that they issued this proclamation. They have been doing it every year since Biden took office, but it is the first time that so-called Trans Visibility Day fell in line with Easter. And instead of doing the simply obvious thing, especially as Biden is a so-called devout Catholic, and simply moving Trans Visibility Day to the following Monday or Tuesday, they decided to allow it to fall on the same day as Easter, which is, the most holy day for Christians. It is the day that Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead after being crucified. And to have a Trans Visibility Day on the same day as this holiday for a religion that fundamentally rejects the notion that God put people in the wrong body was offensive, idiotic, and it was rightly called out immediately for being so. And there were quite a few people, even on the right, on the conservative side, who really downplayed the significance of this cultural shift, I would describe it, by pointing out again that Trans Visibility Day always falls on March 31st. To which there are two obvious responses. The first being, why is the White House recognizing a fake holiday made up by deranged trans activists in the first place? And second, why couldn't they, again, easily have just moved it to the following day to avoid this obvious conflict of interest and sort of usurpation of a very holy day for Christians? And then when the actual statement came out on Sunday from the Biden White House about Easter, I just put the statements side by side and compared lengths and found that the trans visibility statement was about twice as long as the statement that the White House put out for Easter. And this was all combined with the fact that the Biden White House reportedly banned religious imagery on Easter eggs for a decoration contest that they were doing with children who attended the annual White House Easter egg roll. Obviously, Easter cannot be separated from its religious underpinnings. It is fundamentally a religious holiday, and to tell children that they can't put crosses and other religious imagery on their Easter eggs was just downright bizarre and seemed like a furtherance of the Biden administration choosing to suppress and cover up Christianity in favor of these secular new American traditions. The White House also, just back in September, had already celebrated what's known as Trans Remembrance Day, which I wrote an article about at the time for The Spectator, because it's based on the lie that trans people are disproportionately the victims of violence due to their identity compared to non-transgender Americans. And that is, one, statistically false, and two, a form of emotional blackmail to basically guilt trip Americans into accepting the premise of transgenderism under the guise that people will kill themselves or be killed if you don't do so. And then immediately following the declaration of Trans Visibility Day on Easter, we learned that April is apparently Gapril now. So it just is seemingly never ending. Biden was asked about his decision to put out this trans visibility proclamation, and insisted that he didn't do it, and that Speaker Mike Johnson, who called him out for it, didn't know what he was talking about, which raised further questions about who is actually in charge of the White House and how much Biden is actually aware of how much cultural warfare his administration is really advancing. And to put the cherry on top of it all, you actually had the Washington, D.C. Archbishop give an interview on a talk show on Sunday, referring to Joe Biden as a quote unquote cafeteria Catholic, which, if you're familiar with Catholic related insults, you know, is quite the backhanded, petty thing to say about another Catholic, and particularly coming from the Archbishop of the DC Archdiocese is an incredibly strong statement because he is generally someone who does really not wade into questions about Biden or politics writ large. But of course, the so-called devout Catholic has also used his FBI to target traditional Catholic churches and has openly and outspokenly rejected basic Catholic teachings that would result in probably any layperson, if their priest knew about it, prohibiting them from receiving the Eucharist. And yet Biden seems to have no trouble going to Holy Trinity every Sunday and participating in communion. So across the board, this is seemingly a not so big deal if you're just looking at Trans Day of Visibility and you accept the premise that they had no choice but to proclaim it on March 31st because that's when the trans activists told them to. But again, put all together, the Biden administration is clearly sending a signal that Christianity is going out of fashion, and they're going to rapidly accelerate the rate at which that happens. And with that, I will open it up to the group.
I think one way to look at what we witnessed was the White House was celebrating Trans Visibility Day, but also they were celebrating Christian Invisibility Day. And to your point about the DOJ's pursuit of Catholics and really all who don't subscribe to the secular anti-religion of leftism, we have more FACE Act prosecutions coming down the pike, which is to say, if you oppose abortion visibly, you don't have First Amendment rights, apparently, and you are going to have Merrick Garland's Justice Department sicked on you. This was a perfect illustration in a nutshell of that broader point that for the left, the state religion is the anti-religion of leftism, secular leftism. It cannot abide any competing sort of worldview, certainly not traditional faith, which is analogous, obviously, to why in socialist and communist regimes, they have to blot out and destroy any and all organized religion, but in particular, Christianity and Judaism. And it's also telling the best case that the White House could make, besides the gaslighting that they engaged in, is that this is about engaging their core animated voting groups in an election year. And what a comment that is, what a statement that is on the Democrat Party, where effectively they're pro-Hamas, anti-Christian, and then radical gender ideology fanatics. That is the state of the official position of officialdom in the Democrat Party today.
Yeah, I mean, I hope all of our listeners out there are keeping up with the modern American liturgical calendar. Of course, March, we have Trans Visibility Day. Apparently, we have April. And then, of course, we finish up the Lenten season with the Pride Parade, the American Lenten season. I'm laughing, but anybody who doesn't take this seriously, in my view, ought to be completely excised from the right. It's completely untenable in 2024 to imagine that these kinds of proclamations don't have incredible relevance. And it's a reminder, by the way, I believe Biden that he didn't actually sign this and had no idea what was going on. And it's a good reminder that with a Democratic president comes in an entire regime. First of all, 90% of the government now operates with very little oversight from the president whatsoever. And to the extent that there is political oversight, any Democratic president is going to now come in with a host of mostly millennial aged staffers. And if you look at those polls, and I think Ben is right to point to Hamas as another clear indication, support for Hamas between establishment Democrats and their base, Breaking Point, right? those staff are coming in, and to them, this is their liturgical calendar. And it would be shocking for Biden not to recognize Trans Visibility Day. And so even though he's sort of out to lunch on this, and less charitably, actually, I don't know which is actually more or less charitably, he has always been very good at projecting this kind of moderate veneer while his administration runs to the hard left on virtually every single cultural issue, from, redefining sex under Title IX. I mean, there are just endless examples that we've talked about on this podcast, and I'm sure you've heard about elsewhere. And yeah, again, I just anyone who ignores this and ignores the fact that the Democratic base up and coming, the younger Democratic base, this is the direction of the Democratic Party. And like many things, Joe Biden it's merely a transitional figure, perhaps with kind of putting a public veneer over this. But the day-to-day operations of his administration and every Democratic administration going forward is going to operate on this liturgical calendar and is going to operate to the hard left on cultural issues.
So yeah, it's obviously offensive for all the reasons that everybody mentioned, but I find there's a deep irony in the notion of a trans day of visibility, because the primary demand of trans activism is not that we see them, it is rather that we close our eyes, that we do not describe what it is that we are seeing. Like, we see that they're biological sex, and we are told that if we describe what it is we see with our own eyes, that we are being awful and bigoted, that we are misgendering them. So really, they should maybe try changing this to the trans day of non-visibility, or of lying about what you see with your own eyes.
And with that, we'll go right back to Will to break down the recent scourge of squatters' rights in America.
Yeah, so scourge, scourge may be a little bit much, in the sense of we don't know exactly how much squatting is really happening, but we do know that there's some very, very nasty reports coming out of places like New York and California. There was a story in New York about how a woman went on vacation, came home, and found squatters living in her house, and then tried to kick them out. And when she tried to kick them out, the police came and arrested her. There's a lot of nonsense that is possible based on essentially what are very, very old laws designed to deal with a very different time. I mean, they almost come all the way from England, when squatting was a different phenomena, in the sense that most land was part of massive, large landholdings, and people who left cities would go out and live in the countryside and maybe get kicked off by some massive landholder. And so the intuition that people had was that the rights of the squatter need to be protected. That's not anywhere near the truth nowadays. The way that people are using squatters' rights is to try and steal people's homes from out from under them. And the notion of these mass land holdings that, just an individual would innocently stumble and live upon land that wasn't theirs. That's not really the fundamental dynamic. I'm lucky enough to live in the state of Florida, where my former employer, the governor, Ron DeSantis, just signed legislation to really tamp down on some of the biggest abuses, to essentially create a fundamental presumption in favor of landlords and property owners, that when they say somebody on their property is a squatter, they are in fact a squatter, and that merely having shown something that looks like a lease agreement doesn't mean that the police officer has to ignore it and treat it as a civil matter. There's also punishment for this phenomena of the use of fake leases. I think one of the things that the law contains is a new felony provision that says if you invent a fake lease, or you forge a fraudulent lease in order to stay in a home as a squatter, that is a felony itself, and that will also lead to serious criminal penalties. And so again, you have Florida leading the way. It's just one of these simple situations where quick legal fixes is sufficient to solve the problem, and places that don't implement those legal fixes have it out for homeowners. And I mean, there's a lot of other problems in trying to rent property in places like California and New York, difficulties evicting people for non-payment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it is nice to see that there is one place that actually just has something simple that works, which is, hey, respect basic property rights. And you'd think that wouldn't be that controversial, but apparently it is. Apparently that, letting people squat has some constituency probably on the DSA left. That said, the anti-squatting legislation in Florida did get a unanimous vote across the House. I suspect that when it comes to a vote in most states, you'll see modernization of these anti-squatters laws that are being abused by a variety of people.
Yeah, just a few things to add. Will's right to distinguish us from adverse possession, which is a very long tradition in Anglo-American law. And that was, I mean, it really does come from the Lockean theory of mixing your labor with the land, right? And the idea is supposed to be that if there's truly abandoned land, right? If somebody has allowed the land to go fallow in their absence, the technical owner has not put either visited nor put any labor into the property for usually these periods are 7, 10, 12 years, right? It's supposed to basically prevent property from being abandoned. And if somebody is going to then improve upon the property, it transfers title of abandoned property. That's the purpose of adverse possession. It's absolutely not intended to provide cover for somebody basically going into, say, a vacation home, or somebody who's been on vacation, let's say for 3 weeks, and comes back to find somebody squatting in their home. The law is not supposed to provide any recourse for that person other than being kicked out and hopefully held responsible for any damages. Like Will said, this is interacting with really, really strong tenants' rights. So you start out with a facsimile of adverse possession, and then you move immediately to categories that are totally excluded from adverse possession, like tenants, overstays, like all those sorts of things. But as Will said, these people aren't really engaging in this old Anglo-American tradition of adverse possession. What they're doing is trying to use very, very generous laws in blue states to essentially take over people's property and live there for free as long as possible, while it becomes very, very difficult and expensive for the property owner to get rid of them. And like Will said, it is a fairly easy thing to fix. It's not difficult, and it will be one of the many ways in which blue states continue to shove their thumb in the eye of the sort of productive class of people who are still keeping them afloat. In fact, a lot of the national focus on squatters and squatters' rights came from a story in New York City where a woman entered her mother, who I believe her mother had recently passed away. The daughter who had inherited the apartment entered the apartment only to find squatters there. And who I believe killed her. I have to go and read this story again, but like they were violent towards her. So this is not just a property issue, it's a safety issue. There were viral videos of people crossing the border saying, hey, you want to get a free apartment in New York City? Find one that, you know, the owner's on vacation, and claim adverse possession, claim squatters' rights, claim fake tenants' rights. And by the time that all of these rights are exhausted in court, you know, the homeowner will have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars. You will have a free place to live for 6 months, a year. So there are people taking advantage of and spreading the ability to take advantage of these kinds of legal structures who are just coming into the country illegally. So yes, quick fix. No political will to do so in blue states, unfortunately.
It's just beyond infuriating, you know, in this country when we talk about the American dream and how in most people's conception of the American dream, it includes buying a house, being a property owner, having something that you have equity in, that you invest in to make it better, that you take pride in, and to know that there's all of these legal avenues that people can use to take advantage of you and usurp your property, just further adds to this idea that the American dream is dying, that all of these things that we took for granted in terms of our intrinsic rights, in terms of the way that we orient society towards good things, like allowing people the opportunity to have something that they own and that they put their sweat and their labor into and are proud of. It's just so sad to see things like this. And I mean, both Will and Inez pointed out rightfully that this is not a new issue. My family members dealt with squatters back in the 90s when they bought a house that was foreclosed on, and basically the woman just refused to leave, and the police told them there's nothing they could do. But as we have this increased shortage in housing, and couple that with an increase in demand thanks to the millions of illegal immigrants who come across the southern border and are immediately guaranteed housing by these blue cities, you basically have created a recipe for disaster. And I think, barring more actions like the ones taken in Florida, this is only going to continue to spread as the word gets out through social media and other channels, that either deadbeats or illegals are going to use this to try to take as much advantage as they can from Americans who work hard and do the right thing and don't deserve to have their rights trampled on like this.
It's even perverse, the language here, squatters' rights. These are people who steal property and they get protected by the government for God knows what reason. Although we actually know what the reason is. The reason is that for the left, property belongs to whoever takes it effectively. They don't obviously believe in protections on property rights. And this, to me, speaks of a theme that we speak to a lot, which is the notion of a narco-tyranny. If you are, I guess, in this case, a protected class of the regime, well, you get all those protections. But if you are a law-abiding citizen and property owner, you get no protection from the government in blue jurisdictions. In fact, you might even be treated as the aggressor for daring to try to repossess your own property. It's obviously asinine. It speaks to the utter chaos in blue jurisdictions across the country. And I guess it probably also would be rooted, if you asked a leftist about this, in the notion that society somehow failed these people and they've been victimized. And consequently, it is somehow their quote unquote right to be able to take your stuff, in this case, living in your residence. And the question that, as I come back to, and it's a rhetorical question, but it's also a real question, is at what point do people in blue jurisdictions once again get mugged by reality? Or is there literally nothing that can happen in the way of these gruesome stories, like ones pertaining to squatters or people getting physically assaulted, drug needles strewn across sidewalks, and all manner of chaos and crime around them? Is that something that people are going to continue abiding, and particularly elites are going to continue abiding in cities, or will they just move to the suburbs so they don't have to deal with the consequences of their policies? I guess stay tuned, but there still has yet to be, I think, anything remotely resembling a full mugging by reality moment or wave. We've seen traces of it, obviously, with respect to the schools and the backlash against radicalism in K through 12 schools that people witnessed while their kids were home during pandemics. But there's still yet to be a massive reformation in the cities beyond certain rhetorical postures taken by the likes of a Governor Kathy Hochul in New York, where, as someone rightly said, the stated policy went from defund the police to bring in the National Guard. But it's not clear that that sort of ethos rings across blue jurisdictions in this country. And I guess we'll see on election night if there's any signal within the noise to be found in terms of a mugged by reality response in these jurisdictions.
And we're going to go right back to Ben to cover the Democrats' attempt to undermine election integrity.
Right. So last week, I spoke a bit about a story that I didn't think was getting a lot of play, but that was worthwhile, which is this lawsuit that a couple dozen Pennsylvania legislators engaged in against not only Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania, but also challenging the Biden administration and its Biden Bucks executive order, which, for background, is an executive order that puts every single federal agency, 600 plus offices, pledges that they will do whatever they can to register and mobilize voters with a particular focus on quote unquote underrepresented voting groups and those who have been systematically suppressed historically in the Biden administration's view, and calls on every agency, no matter what their actual mandate is, to also partner with quote unquote nonpartisan third-party groups to execute these voter registration and mobilization efforts. And the administration has really hidden almost everything it can about the implementation of the order, including sitting on the strategic plans every agency was to develop, what the criteria were for these third-party groups. But all the evidence that we've seen suggests that you have every agency under the sun, from the Department of Education pushing for the use of work-study funds to be paid out to students to engage in electioneering, to those agencies which deal with handing out welfare, essentially trying to mobilize voters, that this is a play which was conceived of by Demos, by the way, on the outside, to essentially turn every agency into a likely Democrat get out the vote machine in coordination with obviously left-leaning third-party groups on the outside under guise of expanding enfranchisement to those who are underrepresented among eligible voters. So the bad news is that the case was dismissed in Pennsylvania federal court on standing grounds, however, not on the merits. But recently, the Federalist reported that the plaintiffs in the case are looking to take it to the Supreme Court now. So we will see ultimately if the Supreme Court potentially grants cert, and then if we actually get some resolution in a relatively near term on whether Biden bucks are a legal use of government power rather than a usurpation of states' rights, if not potentially a violation of the Hatch Act, where you have government employees essentially engaging in political activities, partisan political activities on the taxpayer dime. A couple other stories worth noting before I get to sort of the meat of this segment, which is that in Wisconsin, there were ballot initiatives voted upon yesterday. We're recording this April 2nd. Yesterday, amending the Constitution to bar Zuckerbucks, which were sort of the model, it seems, for what the federal government has done, private financing of election offices to influence those offices, it's seemingly based on studies, drive out the votes, particularly mail-in voting in predominantly Democrat areas, and use that to win in the 2020 election. Wisconsin voters signed up for a constitutional amendment barring the use of Zuckerbucks, as well as presenting anyone but those officials designated by the law to conduct any aspects of the elections. Last but not least, we have polls, including a recent Wall Street Journal poll showing Donald Trump winning in 6 of the 7 battleground states. And if you look to the Real Clear Politics averages, he's consistently had leads in polling across the battleground states, oftentimes beyond the margin of error. And so you have basically what appears to be the public sentiment on the one hand, but then you have a Democrat machine on the other hand. And I'm going to be reporting about this soon for Real Clear Investigations. But beyond the Biden bucks, which I spoke to, there's also an effort that hasn't gotten as much play, but the Capital Research Center, I think, has put out some compelling analysis to show that Democrats are also using charitable organizations to flow hundreds of millions of dollars into putatively nonpartisan groups, and this is an analog to the Biden administration, flow tax-deductible hundreds of millions of dollars to 501c3 charitable organizations that present themselves as nonpartisan, but engage in voter registration and get-out-the-vote drives, again, with a particular focus on demographics which disproportionately vote blue, minorities, females, etc. And they make it very clear that they're pursuing, one of these groups uses the label, a new American majority, but they have in past elections, collectively, the few major entities that are involved in collecting money and then flowing it down to what amount to likely Democrat get out the vote registration and get out the vote machines. They flowed hundreds of millions of dollars down and gotten over 5 million people registered to vote over a 5+ year period. This, according to the Capital Research Center's analysis, because the voter registration efforts and mobilization efforts were targeted largely towards the swing states in 2020, may have, based upon the analysis, swung those swing states towards Joe Biden. And this was something that was not really talked about, for example, in Molly Ball's infamous Time magazine article on the shadow campaign that swung the 2020 election. I'm going to be reporting on how this did significantly impact the 2020 election, and it is being geared up again to swing the 2024 race, with major Democrat super PACs advising that this is the highest and best use of every Democrat megadonors under the sun's dollars, flowing funds to these charitable organizations which appear to flout the IRS laws against backing what, in effect, are partisan entities. So Biden bucks, Zuckbucks has been rebranded under the U.S. Alliance for Excellence in Elections. It's a smaller dollar effort, but still a pervasive effort going on in jurisdictions across the country, largely that haven't barred Zuckerbucks, and then Biden bucks as well. So my question to the group is kind of, first, do you think that there's anything remotely resembling this machine on the right? It appears that the right is largely focusing on defense in lawfare efforts around protecting election integrity measures. Do you see anything remotely resembling this? Or do we have public sentiment on the one hand, which appears to be pro-Trump, on a collision course with a machine, which represents a massive, it seems like vertically integrated Democrat get out the vote machine funded with taxpayer dollars now? What wins ultimately in that competition in 2024? I'd open it up to the group for thoughts.
I'll just start by pointing out, in addition to your reference of the polling that shows Trump leading in 6 swing states, Ben, that also the Cook Political Report just re-rated the Nevada Senate race from a lean Democrat to a toss-up, and that will likely take place between the incumbent Jackie Rosen and then retired Army captain whose name is escaping, Sam Brown. He's likely to win the primary. So there's even more reason now for the Democrats to want to enshrine these sort of extra democratic attempts to swing elections their way. And I think your reporting is really important in that context of the banning of Zuckbucks, because there have been more than 24 states now that have banned the outside influence of private actors like Mark Zuckerberg from being able to pour money into these attempts to change the course of elections in terms of how they're actually operated in these states, as well as the one small victory that Republicans have had on this issue, which is to prevent the Democrats from passing their massive federal takeover of the election system through their so-called voting rights bill. But to answer your question, generally speaking, the Republicans are very much on defense on this issue. They weren't prepared for the massive overtaking of the election process that took place during the 2020 election. And since then, one of the many, many reasons that Ronna McDaniel was pushed out at the RNC by Trump is because he was not satisfied with what that body was doing in order to make sure something like that didn't happen again. And now the new RNC co-chairs are heading up some kind of supposedly more broad and larger election integrity unit. Although just knowing the RNC, I would perhaps keep expectations low.
Yeah, I mean, the maddening thing about this topic is that you can present, as Ben just did, the facts about the private money. There's what we are calling the Zuckbucks. Then there's the public component of this. And of course, Democrats laid all of this out in that Time magazine article, The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign that saved the 2020 election, where they just went through efforts like the ones that we're discussing here, as well as coordination between social media companies to get rid of negative stories for the Bidens, right? And several other elements. And yet, even though it's admitted to by Democrats, this kind of story will be treated as conspiracy theory. It'll be censored on many social media platforms. Thankfully, one thing that's different than 2020 is we do have one social media platform, that is X, that probably will not censor this kind of information. But YouTube is still flagging discussions like ours about Zuckbucks, right? So they're really it is very disheartening. So many things have of this type, especially have suffered, or I don't know which is really more annoying, but like have gotten the New York Times 3 to 5 years later. It's okay to admit to something that was heavily censored before, like the origin of COVID or various discussions about vaccines, or now most recently, the New York Times actually was able to put together a story, 3 years too late, on the massive learning loss that happened during the pandemic. This really hasn't even gotten that treatment, even though that Time magazine article laid out much of what conservatives were worried about and and failed to fight in 2020, to Amber's point about Ronna McDaniel and the RNC. It doesn't look like I'm not particularly optimistic that the RNC, not under Ronna McDaniel, will be much more of an effective tool against these kinds of things, but state law might be. And there is still time for states to shore up their election integrity laws, to forbid public and private money from going into these organizations. I mean, let's be clear about this. The ratios are so lopsided. A lot of times, some of the Zuckerberg groups that were doing this, the registration numbers were like 83, 89% Democrat to Republican in these efforts. So it's not subtle. It's not one of those things where like it's 55-45, they're registering a few more Democrats. No, these are clearly targeted at Democratic constituencies, and they're built that way on purpose. So yeah, I mean, there's still time for states to act. I don't know how much confidence I have in the RNC to act.
Yeah, I'll make one small point that I'm a little more white-pilled on this, just because I have a thesis that the ground game doesn't matter nearly as much as people think it does. I take this from having worked on the DeSantis campaign and knowing that the campaign spent millions and millions of dollars organizing voters in Iowa, and the end result of all that money was not very much. And so I suspect that, the actual value of, this sort of get out the vote ground stuff is not very high, but it's something that political sultans can do with the money that's afforded them. They need a reason to exist. So if there's I wouldn't be optimistic that we're going to have a better ground game than the Democrats. We certainly aren't. If the Democrats have managed to mobilize, obviously, taxpayer funds as they shouldn't, and Republican, I suspect Trump is not going to have a lot of money on this front. But ultimately, I think, if ground game is what determined things, Trump wouldn't have won Iowa by 30 points. So hopefully ground game is actually less important than people think it is.
And we are going to go to Inez to talk us through some recent tragic stories about euthanasia and its prevalence in the West.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a uplifting topic, but I think it's a necessary one. There has been a story that's gone viral, and it's not the first of its kind. This particular story is out of the Netherlands. Zoraya ter Beek. This is a 28-year-old woman who suffers from depression, autism, BPD, all the sort of usual mental health ailments of the age, and has been approved to end her life by assisted suicide in the Netherlands in early May. So this is a physically healthy 28-year-old woman who just doesn't see that life is worth living, and the state is going to assist her in killing herself. And so this is a woman with a house, a boyfriend, a life, but she just doesn't feel that life is worth living. There's a psychiatrist or psychologist who deserves to have their license pulled, who told his patient that it's never going to get any better than this. And all of this is to say, I'll quote, this is a great free press reporting story about this woman and about the prevalence of euthanasia and the increasing prevalence of euthanasia in the West, which quotes Theo Boer, who was on the review committee in the Netherlands for these kinds of requests, these euthanasia requests, for 10 years. And ultimately he resigned because he said that euthanasia and death has gone from being seen as a last resort to the default option. And the Netherlands is not alone in this. In the US, we've had states, multiple states, Washington, D.C., some of the West Coast states that have legalized euthanasia. We've seen requests for that go up by 53% since those legalizations took place. And we also see a differential between the states that legalized euthanasia and the states that did not in terms of the overall suicide rate, meaning the states that legalized euthanasia have a higher overall suicide rate. So this is adding to the suicide more than likely. In Canada, there's been 125% increase just in a few years. And we have seen multiple times, this always starts out as the most sympathetic case, which is somebody who is in an enormous amount of pain with a terminal diagnosis, and moves very, very quickly down that slippery slope to physically healthy people who merely for whatever reason, want to request to die, and the state is giving its imprimatur to those requests. And there's a couple points that I think this demonstrates. One is, of course, about euthanasia itself. I very much tie it together with all of the other, I guess, indices of despair in the West and meaninglessness in the West, with rising drug addiction rates, with falling fertility rates, falling family formation rates, alcoholism going up, younger generations reporting higher levels of hopelessness. When asked question, for example, is there is meaning in my life? We see that American young people, teens all the way through in their 20s, are much more likely to say no than previous generations. And there is obviously a sort of existential element and philosophical or even theological element to all of this in the West. The West is not perpetuating itself in 1,000 ways, and this is one of them. But I think there's a more pragmatic, in a way, lesson to be drawn from these experiments with euthanasia. And one is that it demonstrates pretty conclusively to me the normative power of the law. And when we look at the rates before and after, and we look at how these permission slips to kill yourself increase, and the slippery slope goes ever downward in terms of what is considered a reason to kill yourself, we find that the default in society against suicide, against dying, against death, starts to slip. And there are fewer and fewer reasons, especially if one is in a secular, libertine-oriented sort of moral framework. There are fewer and fewer reasons why we would even have any social program around suicide. And indeed, that's the way that these laws are argued for, that it's a violation of rights. And it's a violation of personal autonomy, and not for society not to endorse this choice as equal to any other, including, of course, continuing to live. And so that's one. It really does demonstrate that link between, there isn't that much space, especially in the sort of cultural milieu we find ourselves in. There isn't that much space between what's allowed by the state and what's endorsed by society. And, I think a lot of people try to separate those two things increasingly with this topic, euthanasia. That's an academic distinction, not a real world distinction. Functionally, what has happened is when the state allows euthanasia and puts its imprimatur on it being legal, it becomes an option that cannot be morally condemned. And the second thing is related, which is that we often downplay, I think, in the age of oversharing and like hypocrisy is often seen as the absolute worst sin, and we want everything out there in the public altogether. And the second lesson I think we should take from this euthanasia debate is actually that some things are better off not being in the spotlight and not being endorsed by the law or by society, and where nevertheless we might turn a blind eye to it. So before these laws went into place, there were vanishingly few prosecutions of people who, in those terminal painful situations, of doctors or nurses who might have prescribed a little bit too much morphine, for example, to a family and said, look, if you think that the pain is too much, we're essentially going to look the other way. There are vanishingly few prosecutions in those cases. And there was no social sort of movement to have those prosecutions, right? To go after people who, in those quiet and very, very intimate personal situations, made incredibly difficult decisions about end of life, right? And there was no calamity in terms of, and ultimately, there is the autonomy to kill yourself always, right? You can always put a gun to your head. This is America. Everyone can buy a gun. And so it existed, but it did not have, crucially, that imprimatur of the law or of society. And what we're seeing is that imprimatur makes all the difference. That in the name of sort of putting everything out there and being honest about autonomy and end of life, what we've created is a situation in which there's no social stricture against killing yourself. And in many cases, we're now starting to see it flip into actual pressure for people who are burdens or their care is expensive, right? We're actually seeing it slip over into encouragement to just off people who are a burden, as we all will be at some point in our lives, whether very young or very old, to others and to society. So I don't know what you guys think about this issue, but I think it's a really good encapsulation of how some of those libertarian arguments about autonomy and liberty, if untethered from one, any kind of objective moral concern, and two, from the reality of how people are influenced by the law in what they see as moral or immoral or good or bad, can lead very, very quickly to dystopian results.
I think you absolutely nailed it, Inez. There's always a fundamental problem with humanity attempting to play God, and it turns out we're not very good at it because we're not God, and it doesn't seem to end well. But I just wanted to bring up some of the parallels of this conversation about euthanasia with the way discourse has changed around the topic of abortion, because we now have the same conversation where the left refers to abortion as healthcare or reproductive rights, and euthanasia is now referred to by doctors as treatment. And abortion used to be held up as something that should be safe, legal, and rare, and now it's something that has to be shouted and celebrated and viewed as itself some kind of intrinsic moral good, and really stems from those same arguments about autonomy, and we can see how quickly these things unravel.
Yeah. Euthanasia, obviously, I mean, if everything Inez says is right, people just, I mean, if anybody's ever thinking about suicide, you just need to realize that, it's not just about you, your relationships with your parents, with your children, with your friends, everybody will be changed if you're gone. So like, and that's a big part of the reason why there needs to be no social imprimatur on it. Basically it's yet another instance where there's like an edge case where it's justifiable, terminal cancer and extraordinary pain and things like that. And then all of a sudden, once you grant, people the edge case and legalize it, suddenly it just expands massively to cover everything that it didn't. And this is one of those cases where I think Inez's point is exactly right. Like if people really are desperate, they can find a way, but it just absolutely needs to not have the imprimatur of the state and should generally be viewed as very shameful action, just to minimize it.
I don't have much to add to all these great points on a very disturbing and sad topic, except just to reemphasize again the distinction between liberty, which is rooted ultimately and must be rooted and anchored ultimately in, for America at least, and likely for the rest of the world, Judeo-Christian values and principles, versus libertinism, and how libertinism itself turns into the ultimate kind of tyranny, enslavement, and may lead people to death at their own hands. And then also worth reiterating Inez's point about the fact that while politics is downstream of culture, on the one hand, politics also certainly can normalize and legitimize things and push cultures using obviously the awesome coercive power of the state, if not just the suggestive power of the state, can effectuate dramatic changes within people, within a nation, within a civilization. So it's a useful reminder of the power of the state, and one that conservatives ought to take to heart to the extent we're ever back in power and control over federal executive agencies and on down.
And we're going to transition to final thoughts. I will go ahead and go first to avoid any pregnant pauses. And my final thoughts are regarding an interview that RFK Jr. had with CNN recently, where he attempted to make the argument that Biden is a greater threat to democracy than the former president, Donald Trump. And he was speaking somewhat hypothetically, but also made clear in subsequent interviews that he very well thinks it could be the case that Biden is a greater threat to democracy, while condemning what he said were Trump's moves to challenge the election in an improper way in 2020. But he pointed out his case against the Biden administration on their censorship of Americans through coercion of social media companies and big tech companies. And in addition to that, I would add the DOJ targeting Catholics, which we mentioned earlier in this podcast, going after pro-life activists who allegedly violate the FACE Act while allowing, Supreme Court protesters who are protesting illegally to get off scot-free, going after school board parents, using the FBI to create events of supposed domestic extremism, such as the case with the supposed kidnapping plot against Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And then more generally, just among Democrats, the desire to literally remove the ability of voters to cast a ballot for former President Donald Trump. All of these things, I would say, point to RFK Jr. Being on the right track when he says he could make the argument that Biden is a greater threat to democracy. I would say the answer should be that yes, Biden is.
My final thought is this week is the sad happenings in New York City. Jonathan Diller, who's a Long Island cop, was murdered by somebody who had 21 prior arrests. These were two guys who rightly the police officer saw as up to no good, and he decided to investigate. They were hanging out in the car. There was they were engaging in suspicious behavior. A sort of instinct that turned out to be correct, because one of them had a shiv up his rectum, clearly anticipating being arrested later that night. And it's just demonstrative of a problem in New York, but of course in many other blue states regarding crime, and in particular really lax bail laws that allow people with many prior arrests to just immediately end up back on the street. In fact, apparently the rate of people who go on to reoffend while they are waiting for trial in robbery, larceny, or burglary cases is 70%, are rearrested while they're waiting to go on trial, right? So this is just a situation in which a small percentage of people is committing an extremely large percentage of crime. And instead of dealing with that small percentage of people and incarcerating them and keeping them behind bars, what's happening is, Governor Hochul is doing a lot of smoke and mirrors. We mentioned the National Guard, right, going into the subways in New York City, and apparently the solution is, instead of putting this small percentage of violent and repeat criminals in jail, what we're going to do is make, as my friend and he's in California, and he runs he's engaged in the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, which is like a taxpayer advocacy group. Scott Kaufman said, I don't want to leave out credit to him for this, but he very nicely summed it up. He said, basically, when we refuse to put people in prison, everyone has to live in prison. And that's really what is happening. And so there was an interesting political incident with all of this on top of the tragedy of it, where the governor was turned away from the wake for this police officer. Also, usually politically neutral accounts associated with various police groups have been extremely vocal about this in New York in a way that they haven't been before. They are coming after the New York Times for an incredibly biased sort of write-up about this incident. They have been really vocal about the politics of this and about the fact that assaults on police officers have gone up 20% in recent years in New York. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that we have this revolving door putting criminals immediately back on the street, career criminals. So these cops are going out and encountering the same people over and over again, doing the same things. And it's making their job even more dangerous than it already is. So in terms of what Ben was talking about earlier, tipping points, I don't know that we've really reached one yet, but there is an enormous amount of anger, I think, in the NYPD community over this murder and its preventability. And we can only hope that will put some pressure on even the democratic governance of New York.
My final thought is the fact that there's a criminal trial for Donald Trump that's coming up in less than 2 weeks, and everybody seems to be kind of forgotten about it. We had all these federal trials that got delayed and had legal problems, and the Supreme Court intervening. But meanwhile, that the little case that shouldn't have been but could, the hush money case in New York, has proceeded through everything and is headed to trial with what seems like a pretty extraordinarily biased judge who just expanded his gag order on the president to say that the president wasn't allowed to criticize the judge's daughter, even though the judge's daughter is actually a political consultant who's taken money from Kamala Harris and Adam Schiff, which seems to bring up obvious conflict problems. So yeah, we got a criminal trial for a major presidential nominee coming up in 2 weeks. I think he'll have to be there in person. It's a remarkable turn of events. I don't know that we've ever seen anything like it, and I'm interested. I'm sure we'll have plenty more to talk about on this subject in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I can't wait to see the mental gymnastics necessary to be gaslit on the legitimacy of a case that is seemingly beyond, contorted even beyond the civil cases. The Georgia election challenge turned into a RICO case of the century. This one is even more absurd on its face. So we'll look forward to your analysis, Will, and us talking about this in the weeks to come. I'll go with one negative story and one positive story to round things out. Negative is that a state bar court judge in California ruled that John Eastman ought to be disbarred. And as of yesterday, at least, the relevant California systems showed that John Eastman was disbarred. This is in connection with his counsel provided to President Trump around January 6th and what options were with respect to certification of electors. In my view, this is an utter abomination. John Eastman is a legal scholar of the highest order, and this shows you that someone who came that close, who flew that close to the sun in terms of potentially challenging the regime, and if you listen to and read what John Eastman has written about his deliberations at the time, this was clearly a good faith effort and someone who believed he was doing really his God-given duty to defend the republic from a rotten and corrupted election. He bears the price of being disbarred. He obviously has to deal with the legal fees associated with that 10-week kangaroo court style trial, then the appeal to it, which he has said is forthcoming. And then beyond that, the Georgia case as well. I think there's also a case to disbar him for proceedings before the Supreme Court as well. Jeff Clark as well is going through a former DOJ official under President Trump is going through a similar railroading right now. And this not only illustrates the price you pay if you dare to again come up against the regime and threaten it in serious ways, and of course is a symbol to others. Don't you dare ever consider representing a conservative in election challenges or potentially beyond. But to add insult to injury, if you ever met or dealt with John Eastman, he's an incredibly decent human being. So it's not as if some bad person got what was coming to them in a corrupted and rotten lawfare inquisition. This was also a good and decent man who, by all accounts, was doing what he thought was his duty as an American. And to get railroaded the way he has is truly a black mark, in my view, on the republic, whatever you make of the legal merits of his positions, which were deeply grounded in history, precedent, and beyond. So opposite that negative story, a positive one, I thought that J.K. Rowling did an amazing job of challenging this recent hate crime law that was implemented, challenging the Scottish police to arrest her for quote unquote misgendering people in a social media thread. Scottish authorities did not take the bait. She won't be arrested, but I think the reductio ad absurdum tact of showing the insanity of these illiberal and autocratic policies that Western regimes are implementing to silence and chill dissenters, this is how it's done. So kudos to J.K. Rowling for her efforts there.
I interviewed John Eastman a couple of years ago, and his family invited me to go skiing with them. And when I told them that I didn't know how to ski, they offered to teach me. So very, very nice family. That's going to do it for us this week. On behalf of Inez, Will, and Ben, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Amber Duke, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.